This time is about the economics of rebellion. And the presenter is Yuri Zhukov from University of Michigan. I think we shall start because otherwise we will run out of time very soon. Okay?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Okay, try mine.
Okay. Все слышно? Okay, so thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to present a paper from a broader project in which we're trying to collect data on the Donbass conflict in near real time. Near real time meaning from several hours to several weeks, depending on how much free time I have to update the data set. But the question I'm going to try to answer here today is what explains local variation of violence? And by local, I mean from village to village, from day to day, from week to week. And there have been several explanations out there for this type of variation. Probably the one that has gained most currency in the public debate, and also one which we heard quite a bit last night at the plenary session, is this one: Russian aggression or Russian support for the rebellion. And that if we're trying to look for the root causes of the violence and the driving force behind it, we need to look no further than the Kremlin. And I'm not going to disagree with that. I think if Russia had a different policy, certainly this conflict would not have dragged on as long as it has. It would not have reached the intensity that it has, and it may not have happened at all. But as a social scientist, as a political scientist studying conflict at the micro level, this explanation strikes me as incomplete and not very helpful. This is one of those rare cases where just because a model is true does not make it particularly useful. And what it doesn't explain is this. Why would two villages located in the same general area experience such strikingly different levels of violence? Why would the residents of one town be more receptive to Russian propaganda, to Russian support, than residents of another? And if I live in one of these villages, and if I want to know what is the probability that the so-called DNR or LNR are going to take over my village tomorrow, an answer that sounds along the lines of, well, it all depends on what Putin has for breakfast. If he feels like your village should be taken over, it will be taken over. That's not very useful to me. And so I'm going to try to look beyond this kind of monocausal explanation and try to delve into some of the political economy literature on conflict, which has, over several decades, tried to explain questions just like this one. Now, I'm going to try to evaluate the relative explanatory power of two sets of explanations here. The first of these is that ethnic nationalism, particularly Russian nationalism, is the driving force behind this local variation, that we should expect more violence in areas that are home to geographic concentrations of either ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. Now, there's a lot of literature on ethnic conflict in political science and in economics. The rational choice branch of this literature has focused on several potential mechanisms behind why we may expect this kind of effect, ranging from the exclusion hypothesis and perceived discrimination against previously powerful ethnic groups. So some of the public debates surrounding the language law might fit into that category. There's also a broad literature in the bargaining models of conflict that look at things such as the potential indivisibility of territory, potential commitment problems that an ethnic majority might have in bestowing things such as regional autonomy and decentralization, and incredibly committing to these kinds of promises at a time when the underlying balance of power is shifting. There's also an extensive literature on collective action problems and the potential ability of territorially concentrated ethnic groups to overcome them, to be able to identify defectors within their own ranks, to punish free riders. And finally, there's a broad literature, particularly in international relations, on transnational ethnic conflict. The existence of an ethnic diaspora across the border, or worse still, a state in which that ethnic diaspora is the majority, and the potential for that ethnic diaspora to prolong and intensify a conflict in which the territorially concentrated ethnic group is very much the locus of the violence. the problem that I've had in trying to view the Donbass conflict as an ethnic conflict is that this conflict has not been fought primarily along ethnic lines. I don't need to tell you that there are Russians and Ukrainians on both sides. There's no shortage of Russian speakers on the Ukrainian side of this conflict, including in some of the volunteer battalions that are characterized in the Russian media as being ultranationalist. So the other set of explanations that I'm going to look into here are economic shocks. There's a substantial literature in economics and in political science about the potential impact of negative economic shocks on violence. And the logic here is very much that of opportunity costs. As wages drop, as unemployment goes up, the opportunity costs of fighting go down. And as that happens, more people will fight. And from this standpoint, the Donbass has been uniquely vulnerable to three sets of economic shocks, which I explore in the paper, which I'm going to talk about at somewhat shorter depth here. The first of these is the potential free trade agreement with the EU and the differential vulnerability of specific industries within the Donbass to this agreement. So some industries, such as metals, are actually going to be one of the beneficiaries of this free trade agreement. Others, such as machine building, for which there's not a lot of demand in Europe or really outside of Russia, are potentially going to be much worse off. A second type of shock is austerity, and particularly the end of state subsidies to coal mines. So one of the policies that Yanukovych enacted under his presidency is to try to keep a lot of these failing mines afloat. Basically, he extended substantial state subsidies to pay workers' salaries. These mines would produce nothing. The people who work there would be paid mainly to keep the mines operational, to prevent them from flooding, prevent explosions. But they wouldn't really be producing any coal. And due to the terms of the IMF loans extended last spring, many of these subsidies are going to stop. A lot of mines will close down. But the third set of shocks, which I think are probably the most important ones here to consider, are the Russian trade war, Russian import substitution, which will have, again, a differential impact on different industries in the Donbass and a differential impact on different towns depending on which industries the people there are employed in. The long-term Russian policy of import substitution, for instance, particularly targets the machine building sector. This started in the defense industrial complex as Russia tried to move the full production cycle to the Urals, to domestic factories. And it extended even further for locomotive production, a lot of which has been traditionally concentrated in Lukhanchina and is now being increasingly concentrated across the border in Russia. And if you're thinking about towns, basically company towns in which there's one main employer, a large factory like Luhansk Teplovoz, and where 60 to 90% of the exports go to Russia. A Russian trade war can potentially be very dangerous. And so, and hopefully with some micro-level data, I will hopefully convince you that the second of these economic shocks is a more plausible explanation given the data. And I will test these, the relative power of these explanations with a unique data set that I and my research team have been collecting over in Michigan. We draw on incident reports from Ukrainian, Russian, international media sources, as well as some rebel sources. So we have Channel 5, Espresso TV, one of our sponsors, as I understand. We have military blogs such as Dmitry Timchuk's Informaционное сопротивление. We have Ukrainian news agencies such as Ukrinform. And of course, we have a nice little news source called Ruskaya Vesna, which has a slightly different perspective on these things. We also have incident reports from the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission and also Wikipedia. Why not? And so for each of these sources, we've scraped down everything that they have published on this conflict over the past year. Actually, the actual data set goes back to November of 2013, and it ends, I guess, today. The subset of the data, which I'm going to present you, looks at essentially the first year of the conflict, from the days immediately following Yanukovych's departure to the days immediately following the second Minsk ceasefire agreement. And to geocode these events, we have a geocoding script that identifies place names within these individual reports. It matches them against the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's data set of populated places. There are about 3,000 of them in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. And so that's the scatter plot that you see here. What this doesn't tell us right away is what these reports are about, whether they're about violence at all, whether they're about rebel violence, whether they're about state operations. And to that end, we use automated text analysis and supervised machine learning, in particular the support vector machine. And so the way this works is my research team and I, we take a randomly selected subset of these incident reports. We categorize them into predefined categories such as initiator, target, tactic. Is it an artillery strike? Is it a multiple rocket launcher type incident? Were there casualties involved? And then we use those training sets, and we have a different one for each of these data sets in the original language and also machine translated into English. We use that training set to then train a computer algorithm to recognize new events, be they rebel attacks or government attacks, as they come in. So this way we're able to get near real-time data collection on this conflict. There's a lot of reporting bias, as I'm sure you all know, between Ukrainian and Russian media. Here's a scatter plot, or rather a word cloud of the terms included in the documents coded as rebel violence among Ukrainian sources. This actually, I think, is the Espresso TV text corpus. And overwhelmingly, Ukrainian sources focus on indiscriminate shelling by terrorists. You can see терористи обстріляли українських військових. That's a typical description of a rebel incident that you would see in the Ukrainian press. A very different picture if you read the Russian media, of course. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And here the focus is very much on ополченцы захватили украинских силовиков. That's kind of the modal document type for Russian sources. So if you were to read only Russian sources, you would get the sense that these are very highly selective detentions that are happening during these rebel operations. If you were to read Ukrainian sources, you would get the sense that it's almost without exception, indiscriminate shelling and bombardment. I'm not going to even get into how these sources treat the government events. That's a whole other aspect. I'll just tell you that the descriptions in the Ruskaya Vesna database are very interesting. Very creative terms are used. My personal favorite is Ukrovermacht. So a lot of reporting bias, and the way we try to address this, at least for the rebel events, is by drawing out some of the literature from natural language processing and event data, and how you aggregate individual events. So we have these 3,000 or so populated places in Donetsk and Luhansk, and by populated places I mean village up to a city. And so for each of these populated places, for each day during the first year of the conflict, we look at whether each of these sources, each of these 10 sources that I just showed you, published an event that was coded by the supervised machine learning algorithm as being a rebel attack. We merge these sources, and then we use a one-a-day filter. One-a-day filter is a pretty standard approach in the event data literature. It basically screens out double counts. Potential drawback is that on days with a high intensity of rebel violence, that information is lost. And so for the analyses that I'm going to show you, I'm going to aggregate this up to the weekly level, in which case this variable will range from 0 to 7, with a maximum of 7 incidents per village per week. Now, I'm going to click on the plot to run the animation, Acrobat Reader only, just to show you the distribution over time. So there's not a lot of violence during the first few weeks of the data set. There are a lot of protests happening, and then in April of 2014 it really begins to pick up. And this is, I guess, after the referendum in Donetsk and Luhansk, and this is where the violence really begins to escalate, around midsummer of last year. Probably July and August is kind of the apex of the conflict, and then there was the first Minsk ceasefire agreement. And during the first few weeks of September, as you can see, it didn't really hold. Big surprise. And then it escalated again. There was a flare-up around December and January, and you'll see it right there, all over the front line. And after the second Minsk ceasefire agreement, there was some pockets of fighting around Stanitsa Luhanska and Debaltseve. But overall, things have basically died down. And that's where these data series end that I'm going to show you today, basically the first year of the conflict. So that's our first outcome variable that I'm going to try to model. What explains this variation in rebel violence across space, across time? The other variable that I'm going to try to explain with these economic and ethnic predictors is territorial control. What villages are under control by rebels versus the government on any given day? And here I draw on two sets of sources. These are all georeferenced daily maps. We used the maps that I'm sure you all have seen, released by Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. These are released on almost a daily level. And they show in these beige areas the territories that are under the control of the so-called DNR and LNR, and the rest is territories that are under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. There's also other sources that we use here, which are pro-rebel bloggers. Again, just as there's reporting bias in the reporting of rebel incidents, there's reporting bias in who controls what towns. There's actually a lot of correlation between these two maps. The main difference is when rebels take territory, it takes a few days for government sources to admit it, while the rebel sources are very eager to take credit for territories that they have gained. But overall, there is a very, very high correlation between these two. But these two sets of maps only go back to the beginning, well, I guess to mid-June of 2014. And by the way, the rebel maps are incredibly detailed. They tell you which units are stationed where. And I don't know how credible a lot of this info is, but that's also data that we're trying to mine. But the third source that I'm going to use is Facebook posts on rebel checkpoint locations prior to June of 2014. And the idea here is that, first of all, these maps that I just showed you did not exist prior to June 2014. But what did happen was people driving home and seeing a checkpoint where there didn't used to be one, with armed men with assault rifles asking for their documents. That's strange. I think I'll just update my Facebook page. What we do here is we scrape the Facebook posts on these locations, we geocode them, and we use the convex hull of these data points on any given day to try to gauge the extent of rebel control prior to when the Ukrainian government and the pro-rebel bloggers started releasing data on these events. And I can show you another animation that tracks the distribution of territorial control over time. And again, not a lot of territory being taken in March. There's a lot of protests happening, a lot of attempts to storm regional administration buildings. But it wasn't really until the beginning of April of last year that you saw entire towns being taken over by the rebels. And then after the referendum on the 11th of May, this proto-state began to take shape. During the summer, the Ukrainian armed forces and volunteer battalions began to take territory back, and for a while it seemed like the rebels were on the run. The state was about to be completely abolished off the map. But then something happened, as I'm sure you all know. In late August, there we go, there's the Russian incursion. And after that, the front stabilized. This is the first Minsk agreement. Most of the fighting around there was relatively static. There was a few towns shifting sides here and there, mainly around the Debaltseve pocket, which, as you can see, is an extremely vulnerable position, surrounded on three sides by rebel artillery. And then it pretty much stayed the way it was. Despite the flare-up of violence that we saw in January, the front line didn't really move that much except for Donetsk airport and the Debaltseve pocket. And then eventually, as you'll see, the rebels will close that cauldron, and that's where these data series end. And that's pretty much more or less how the front line looks right now. So that's our two outcome variables, rebel violence, territorial control at the village level. Here are the explanatory variables that we'll use. First, I want to look at local economic conditions. And here I use data from the BVD Orbis database on about 400,000 or so private and state-owned enterprises in these two oblasts. Here's a map just by sector, primary, secondary, tertiary, and here it is broken down by industry. And I focus on these three industries because they are, first of all, they're the big three dominant industries in this region, but also they're going to be differentially impacted by all these negative economic shocks that I outlined. So the machine building sector, like I said, will be worst off. They're the most dependent on Russia. About 45.8% of all Ukrainian machine building is concentrated in these two oblasts. About 60% of what they produce goes to Russia. Some towns, particularly ones where the locomotive industry is concentrated, up to 90% of the production goes to Russia. Mining is a different story. They're only indirectly dependent on Russia. Only about 12% of their production goes to Russia, which makes sense because Russian coal is a lot cheaper. About 33% of what they produce goes to factories that are highly dependent on Russian orders. The rest of, the main way that they'll be affected by these shocks is due to the austerity programs because they are highly dependent on the state subsidy. It's a highly inefficient industry. Steel is a different story. Steel, the Ukrainian steel sector is one of the most competitive industries in Ukraine. They export to 50 different countries and are going to be one of the beneficiaries potentially of this free trade agreement with the EU. They can offset any losses from the Russian market with other opportunities. This is how these industries are distributed, and you can already see that in the kind of the northern section of Luhanshina. It's mainly a service economy, as you can see here, not a lot of industrial employment. The other explanatory variable that I'm going to look at here is the local Russian population based on the 2001 census, which is the latest micro-level, I guess, village-level data that we have. And here I look at both percentage ethnic Russian and percentage Russian speaking in each of these villages. The red areas here are, well, I guess there's a transparency depending on the proportion of the local population that is Russian. Blood red meaning almost 100% Russian speaking. About 38% of Donetsk Oblast is ethnic Russian. About 75% claims Russian as a native language, including 58% of ethnic Ukrainians. So we'll see to what extent this map explains variation in violence in territorial control. I also have data on military geography and a lot of other control variables that I think are important to include, such as elevation. Should expect to see a lot of fighting for good artillery firing positions, such as this one right here in Soul Mohila, which is a key flashpoint last August. We'll look at forested terrain, the ability of rebels to have cover and concealment from government surveillance and from government attacks. Distance to road, basic military logistical factors come into play here, as well as distance to the Russian border. I guess I also have data on the percent Yanukovych vote in 2010, in the second and third round, first and second round, as well as a population density for each village. One potential problem with any kind of spatial analysis is there's going to be more events where more people live. There are more targets there. So we're going to try to control for that as well. And I'm also controlling for spillovers and persistence of violence. Look at violence in neighboring towns and villages, and violence on the previous day or week. So there are a lot of potential explanations already embedded in all these data, right? It could be economics that are driving the violence. It could be ethnicity and language. It could be any of these things. And I don't necessarily have a strong prior across these. And there's a lot of model uncertainty that goes into trying to understand what the driving force behind this violence is, what has the most explanatory and predictive power. And the way that a lot of the conflict prediction and forecasting literature has moved in recent years is we're seeing the increased adoption of methods such as Bayesian model averaging, which is what I use in this paper, because there's uncertainty over the true theory of violence. And the one problem that we often have in political science and economics, and the problem that I have in this paper is nowhere near as extreme as it is, say, in trying to model economic growth. But there's any model that you have is going to be very highly sensitive to the specification. So taking out one variable will potentially wreck the results. Adding a control variable will potentially wreck your results. And so what Bayesian model averaging does, it computes the posterior probabilities over models with all possible combinations of covariates. And so all the things that I just showed you, the percent of the local population employed in each given industry, the ethnic breakdown, it's going to take all of these different variables and run every possible permutation of them. And then it's going to construct a weighted average over the most likely models. So the quantity of interest here is this model-weighted posterior distribution for the coefficients, where the first term here after the summation symbol is the posterior distribution of the coefficient, and the term right after that, the probability of m given yx, is the model weight. And so what the lowercase m is indicating here is the model. So we have model specification. It could be any GLM, where the g to the -1 is an inverse, say, like an inverse logit link. And then those are the covariates in the x. And the x will be different in each of these models. And it's going to compute basically posterior model probabilities over the entire model space. So the first term here, the P of y to the mx, is the marginal likelihood of any given model. And the second term here is the prior. And so where do these priors come from? I'm going to use just uniform prior. Every model is equally likely. I'm a man from Mars who's just come down to Ukraine, has no idea about what's driving the violence. I'm going to assume for the moment that each of these models, each of these possible permutations of the covariates is equally likely. So the model space that I'm going to run this algorithm over contains kind of 4 ensembles of models. The first of these, I'm going to look at the duration until the first rebel attack. What types of villages saw rebel violence soonest? What types of villages saw it later on in the conflict? And for this, I use a Cox proportional hazard specifications, and here with 11 covariates, I have about 2,048 models. Then we'll look at duration until the rebel control, how long does it take for rebels to assert control over a territory. And this is a very different quantity of interest here, because the amount of planning and the amount of logistical sophistication it takes to take over a city center far exceeds what it would take to implement a single terrorist attack. So for instance, the kind of terrorist attacks that we've been seeing in Kharkiv and in Odessa are much easier to implement than taking over a regional administration building, taking over the police station, seizing the weapons, setting up roadblocks to prevent government forces from moving in. It takes a much larger mass of forces to pull something like that off. And so here, as well, I use a Cox proportional hazard model. And then I also look at the dynamics of violence during the conflict. And in any given week, how many days was a given village targeted by the rebels? And here I use a spatial autoregressive quasi-Poisson model. Quasi-Poisson because my outcome variable of interest here is an over-dispersed event count. And what's spatial autoregressive about it is it includes a spatially lagged temporal lag of the number of attacks in neighboring towns than the previous week. About 16,000 models there. And finally, I'm going to look at whether any given village experienced violence at all. What is the difference between villages that have remained relatively peaceful and ones that experienced violence at all? Because actually, a relatively small proportion of the populated places in the Donbass, really about a third of them, experienced any kind of violence over the past year. What's the difference between those villages and ones that remained at peace? And so here I'm just going to run a very simple GLM with a logit link, 4,000 models. So here are my results. So what you're looking at here is basically a plot of the model-weighted posterior distributions of the hazard ratios. The way that you would interpret this is anything to the right of the red line means that a higher value of that covariate correlates with a shorter duration until the first rebel attack. And whereas anything to the left of that line, say, the longer the distance to the nearest road from a given village, the longer it would take for the rebels to assume control. So you would see a hazard ratio less than 1. And what this shows you, and by the way, each of these dots here, the blue dots, is a draw from the posterior distribution of each hazard ratio, the hazard ratio associated with each covariate, and the transparency of the covariate is weighted by the posterior inclusion probability of models including that covariate. So if models that contain a given variable, say here forest or elevation or distance to Russia, have very little explanatory power, the algorithm is going to weigh them down. It's basically going to weigh it down to 0, right? Whereas if models that include that variable have a very high predictive power, it's going to weigh them up. And so what this plot right here tells you right away is that the initial outbreak of rebellion is 3 times more likely in villages dominated by the machinery industry on any given day. So because hazard ratios are very sensitive to the scale of a given variable, I scaled all the variables identical, basically 0 to 1. And so the counterfactual here is if I take every single worker in a village and I give them a job in the machine building industry, that village will now be 3 times more likely to experience an outbreak of rebellion on any given day. And the other determinants of initial rebel violence are military geographic. The further away you are from a major road, the longer it will take for the rebels to get there. Right? Makes sense. And of course, population density, the more densely populated a given area is, the more targets there will be for rebels to attack. And here are the results for the first rebel control. These are somewhat more striking, and there are more things that are significant here. But the general results and the general relative magnitude of the results are the same. Rebels were 65 times more likely to take control on any given day in villages that were dominated by a machinery industry. But the other industries are also relevant here. So you can see there the hazard ratio indicates that rebel control was 3 times more likely to occur in mining towns. But we see the opposite relationship in the metal sector. Again, the one that's less vulnerable to these kinds of negative shocks that we might expect. Russian language and ethnic Russian are also significant here. Just because one model is true does not mean that the other one is necessarily not. But the magnitude of the effect is much smaller. So majority, actually 100% ethnic Russian village, that's the relevant counterfactual here, is about twice as likely to see a rebel takeover in any given day than one that's 100% Ukrainian. Now let's look at the dynamics of violence. Here's a similar plot for the intensity of rebel violence during a village week. What you're seeing here is a similar plot with the model-weighted posterior distributions of just the beta coefficients. And what this tells you is that violence, once again, is much higher in areas where a larger proportion of the population is employed in these industries that depend on Russia, particularly the machine building industry. Here's a marginal effect plot where the blue bars are the 95% credible intervals. So the higher the proportion of the local population employed in the machinery industry, the more attacks a given village will expect to see in any given week. Like I said, the Russian ethnicity is not completely irrelevant here, but the effect is much smaller. The credible intervals are wider. The slope of the line is a little bit flatter, but it's significant nonetheless. Both of these factors clearly play a role, but economics are the stronger predictor. Russian language, however, has absolutely no effect, as we would expect based on what we anecdotally know about who's fighting on both sides. Russian language is the language of command among many of the units fighting the rebels. And so the credible intervals here are so wide that you can draw pretty much a straight line through them. But if we look at rebel violence over the whole first year of the conflict, this is a different model showing the incidence of rebel violence in a village over the entire first year of the war. The Russian effect completely goes away. The only things that are relevant here are weather, well, the extent to which the local population is employed in the machine building industry, as well as these military geographic factors, distance to road, and population density. So, to sum up, the pre-war employment mix is among the strongest predictors of rebel activity. In places that are most vulnerable to these kinds of shocks, rebellion occurs sooner, the central government lost control earlier, these attacks are more frequent, and the risk of separatist violence is greater overall. And so, the bottom line is this is really not an ethnic conflict, which is probably not surprising to a lot of you, but here we finally have some data to back that up. But with this, the larger takeaway of this project, both for the policy side and for the broader literature, is as follows. So export dependence on Russia can be a very powerful economic weapon. So none of this is to say that the determinants of the conflict are purely local. I think a lot of this has to do with the Russian trade policy, Russian trade barriers, Russian import substitution. And by squeezing the parts of the Ukrainian labor force most dependent on trade with Russia, Russia is essentially in a position to activate a civil conflict in another country. To what extent this is intentional or not, I don't know. We won't know until the archives open up many decades from now. But as far as we can tell, with the most comprehensive data set currently available on this conflict, the effect is there. And I'll just reinforce that this is a uniquely granular data set, probably the most comprehensive data set of which I'm aware. Based on my conversations with folks in DC, no one has data at this fine level. Maybe some people at three-letter agencies, but they're not sharing it with us. But anyone with an internet connection and some programming skills can construct a similar data set and essentially show the same results that I just showed you. But there's also a silver lining to the story, which is that the Donbass experience will be very difficult to replicate. The Donbass is unlike any other region of Ukraine. It's the most populous region of Ukraine. 15% of the population is kind of like the west coast of the United States on a proportional level. It's the most heavily industrialized and one of the most export dependent. But the local economic incentives that drive the ability of the so-called DNR and LNR to expand their territory, to attack different villages, have limits. And what I just showed you here gives a very credible explanation of why you see so little violence at the northern part of Luhanshina, which is surrounded by Russia on two sides. Well, it's a service economy. No one works in these particularly vulnerable industries. And where there are relatively few incentives for people to not show up for work and instead go to man a checkpoint, it's going to be much harder for the rebellion to survive. With a caveat that, that just means they're going to be much more heavily dependent on Russian support. It's going to be very hard, basically where local support is hard to find due to these economic incentives. External support will be much more important. And the amount of effort that it will take to push these rebel territories to the borders of these two oblasts and beyond, so far has been beyond what Russia has been willing and able to provide. I think I'll end there, and I'll turn it over to Ruben. Look forward to your questions.
Ruben Enikolopov from University of Pompeu, Fabra.
Okay, thanks a lot for giving me an opportunity to read the paper, because it's not yet publicly available, so I had this unique opportunity. And just to quickly overview, I think this is really like absolutely amazing in terms of the data collection exercise that allows a very detailed analysis of the determinants of violence in eastern Ukraine. And basically then it's used to try to look at the two potential conflicting explanations for the fighting, whether like it's identity-based in some sense or economic expectations. And basically the results show that economic explanations, they're at least as important as the identity-based. And like I'll return back to like this magnitude comparisons. I think it's very impressive in terms of like data collection and precise and policy findings, both from point of view of like theory of conflicts in general and the policy prescription, extremely important findings. And the absence of the paper is like one paragraph, which is buried somewhere in the middle of the paper for a known-to-me reason. Like I think it deserved to be moved like much earlier to come in the paper. Is that basically that this terms pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian, they were treated always like completely ethnically. Whereas actually a lot of it has to do with pure like economic reasoning and the benefits of economic connections with like pro-Western or pro-Russian policies. And this is like the the theories that are being tested. The main problem that I have is actually not a problem. It's like the way the paper can be expanded is that for now it's kind of almost deliberately theoretical, saying that we don't know anything from theories, but actually we do know something from theories. Meaning, like for conflict, you need two parties. Like there should be someone against someone else. So you have to understand not only like in analysis, not only to understand what's going on from the point of view of rebels, but also to understand what's going on from the point of view of the government. Because basically if you take, for example, like this pure ethnic-based, identity-based theory and try to explain where you will see the fighting, you should not see any fighting in whether like zero Russian, like pro-Russian population, because, well, nobody wants to fight. But you also should not see anything if there's like 100% for them. There's no conflict at all. Like, I mean, in some sense, from ethnic point of view, it's fractionalization that should matter in this sense. For incidents of violence, which is a bit different when we start to analyze the extent of rebel control, because for rebel control, it's much easier to make predictions, and like I think it will be very helpful to actually to use theory a bit more to guide the analysis, because some of these things, and this is actually, I think this is reflected exactly in the results, that for incidents of conflict, all the coefficients are much more less precisely estimated, like God knows what's going on, but when you try to understand predict the control of rebels, it becomes much more precise, and all the things become much more precisely estimated, exactly because I think actually all the theories, they are have much more clear predictions on the control than on the incidents of fighting. And if you take into account this these theories, I think the most interesting thing that I would be interested in looking is actually in the interaction of the two stories, because it looks like that you have like that some of this all these factors for now they analyze as completely independent, like the role of Russian support by distance from Russia is like independent from everything, whereas like probably the most interesting thing goes on in the interaction of these two. Like if you have combination of being exposed to trade shocks and having identity based and being close to Russia with the support of our military Russian support, that would be like the prediction, the best prediction. So it's like analyzing all the interactions would be, and it can come like when you start talking about the predictors. Like I can come with like a lot. Like you say that it's your guy, you're agnostic and you come from Mars, and like you're very you came from Mars with the preconception of the 11 predictors that were driving the violence. I came like from the other planet with like other things, and I think some of them are actually very important, and some of them are actually a bit confusing in the way you describe. So you interchangeably use basically industrial concentration and industrial structure, whereas actually you only look at industrial structure, not industrial concentration in the village. And industrial concentration itself is an important predictor, because if it's a really mono city and everyone works in the same industry, you are very exposed to shocks. If there's like other opportunities, maybe you're less vulnerable. So this itself is a very interesting and important point that I think can be exploited, and especially in the fighting. What you used Convex Hulls for, like to measure who is where rebels are controlling. But it looks like from military point, it's actually a very important predictor of where the fighting will be and not. If you look at the like Convex Hulls of like where you're already controlling. So on the borders, that will where you will be observing violence, and inside this Convex Hulls, it's really much likely that the rebels will be having control. So incorporating this into something in prediction, because basically, if you look at the last map of like how they are controlled now, it's really easy. Take Russian border and the biggest cities, like connect them with straight lines, that would be the best predictor, like of all these things. So I think it will be like incorporating these geographical consideration will be an important thing. And in terms of, again, interpretationally, like because I think still it's in the paper it's kind of oscillates between making this a purely prediction exercise and something about the theory. I think it's like it will be helpful to a little bit more put attention to theory, and in terms of like, especially it's important if you want to then generalize these findings to other places or something. Like you have to be theory driving. And with economic factors, for again, you can kind of interchangeably use in the paper. I think that you have to treat them a bit separately, although you may not be able to distinguish them in the analysis, but at least conceptually they are separate two things. One is the opportunity cost channel, meaning that if people are poor and they have not that much on outside options in working in like mining sector, they're more likely to join the insurgency because like they have nothing to lose. And this is true even if you have like exogenous shock to economy, and this is like most of the works that you're citing looking at these exogenous shocks. This is opportunity cost. Another thing is that, well, I mean, they call it greed theories or whatever, but there are some benefits for which you are fighting, and they're also economic. And in this case, it's clearly like this, at least the stated goals of these independent republics were like to become kind of independent in setting the economic policy and change economic policy from being to revert to anti-austerity, more trade, open trade with Russia, etc. So like, the benefits for which they're fighting are also economic, and they're also clearly kind of related to what you are measuring. And it's important to distinguish between the two for like to be able to generalize from, because like exogenous shocks would not affect the second channel, but they will affect the main channel. And like probably like the final point is that I would be much more cautious in trying to compare the strength of the two potential explanations. One of them is just like the thing, minor thing about the real like the numerical exercise that you have. Like if you look at this like marginal plot, you can see that basically like ethnic composition has like 3 times or 3 times less of an effect. However, this is only if you base comparison like 1 percentage point change. So if you increase the share of ethnic Russians by 10 percentage points, what happens? If you increase the mining sector by 10. If you look at the distribution of the ethnicity, this is just the outcome variable, like the units of measurement, they're very different. So the share of Russians varies from exactly 0 to exactly 100% with the standard deviation of basically 0.3. Sorry. Whereas the share of machine industry changes from between 0 to 0.45, and it's like it's impossible to imagine a place in which 100% of people are employed in the machine. It doesn't exist, and the standard deviation is exactly 3 times less than for. So if you look at the counterfactual of not 1 percentage point, like 1 standard deviation change, they become exactly the same. So I would be much more cautious saying that basically my reading of the result is that the economic factors, they're as strong as ethnic. And I would be sticking to this. I think it's enough to make your point. You don't need to say that it's much more important, because it really becomes very much kind of dependent both on the exact macro-units and also actually on the methodological approach. Because it's also, again, it's tricky because it depends on whether you want to do prediction or like something to say something about the causal effects. So Bayesian averaging works really well if there are no problems with it. Well, there are still problems, but there's much less problems with it if you care only about predictions. But if you try to make the point that about the causal argument, that these factors explain violence, not predict, but explain, that becomes a big problem, because this it doesn't, like this whole method has nothing to do with the homogeneity. It doesn't take. It's like it's purely like flat priors become like a problem. There's especially like if you try to do something non-linear. I actually don't know how you do it in Bayesian modeling if you have interaction term, because obviously it's not you cannot just permutate and say that there are like direct effects and interacted effects are randomly, like you can choose them. No, they have to come either both or not. So you have to play with this, and like the error structure here is obviously like if you try to do causal thing, you have to take into account the huge spatially correlated like standard errors. This is not taken at all into account in Bayesian model averaging, because that's not the goal of these models. They used for prediction. But in the end, you make causal statements in the paper, so you have to be like a bit more careful. Like I have some minor points, but they're not important. I'll just give you the slides to look. But I think it's extremely important paper, both in terms of its service to academia by showing the data and showing how it's different. One of the smaller points that I have to mention is that if there's a very strange selection of Russian sources. I think this looking only at Len Taru, which changed completely editorial board in the process exactly because the way they were covering Ukraine, and looking at one relatively minor business FM source is. I don't know what was the exactly reason, especially if you want to do like the other line of your research and trying to analyze how the same things are differentially covered by different media sources. It would be nice to have a more comparable set of Russian sources, which I guess should not be at all problem with you for like machine learning, just taking the similar things. But again, so sorry for distraction. It's a minor theoretical point for the extensions. But the bottom line is that it's a great paper with very important point that the economic factors are playing a hugely important role in these conflicts.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes for questions, and Eric is the first one again.
This time it's not about Georgia. It's been some 30 years since I last attended a political science presentation. I actually studied political science in Jerusalem. It has become much more high-tech since my days. When I studied, it was mostly about political philosophy, history, and stuff like that. I hope it's a sign of progress. But now the point I want to make is one of the things, one of the professors I studied with back in my Hebrew University days was a historian who studied Russian history, and I couldn't resist the temptation to Google his book, one of his books, and it has a title, Yuzovka and Revolution. It has 2 volumes. Yuzovka, those of you who don't know, is actually what used to be before it became what has become Donetsk, I think. So he studies revolution in Donbass from 1869 to 1924. And I must say that I just read the abstract now of his book. He comes pretty much to the same conclusions that you come. Because the classical study of revolution, and there were so many studies, as you can imagine, over the past century, it very much focuses on the questions of hard hats. It wasn't exactly military helmets, but it was about the motivation and the organization of the proletarian workers to go out, organize strikes, and attack the regime. So it was a study of revolutions, not of ethnic, and nothing ethnic. I would just recommend that you look at these historical sources because I think it's fascinating. This one specifically focuses on Yuzovka. So I think it's one to look at because it also incorporates very interesting ethnic elements into the analysis. Thank you. The name is Theodore Friedgut. I can share maybe through the organizers. Yuzovka, and I think if you just Google Yuzovka and the revolution.
Yeah, I have to apologize. We don't have much time, and I think Scott was the second one in line. Yeah, I know we have many questions. It's a very interesting paper, definitely, and I encourage you to approach the speaker and maybe the discussant as well. But we will take one more question, and then we will go to have a lunch break. Yeah.
Okay, and I'll be very brief. So I thought it was a very high-quality paper and a very high-quality discussion as well. Ruben sort of had his own list of variables that on his planet might potentially could be doing some of the work. And I guess sort of one obvious one is exposure to Russian media. And so it sounds like perhaps some sort of discussion with Arturas and Leonid, who have the data, might be useful. My other question is, I'm sort of wondering where workplace mobilization comes in here. So are workers, are they just making this, they understand the dependence of the enterprise on trade with Russia, and they're independently making these decisions to mobilize, or are enterprise directors involved in some way? And to the extent that it's the latter story and not the former, then it seems like the industrial concentration of the town, so whether workers have outside options or not, really does become especially important.
Well, maybe just one more, since we have one more minute. Okay.
Ruben slightly touched on it. Have you considered that another predictor might be that working in a coal mine is a very, very hard life? You get no sunlight. If somebody says, hey, go man a roadblock with a gun, you're like, hey, well, I'm going to die anyways, I might as well get some sunlight. But whereas working in the steel industry, you kind of have to use your brain a bit. It's a better life than coal mining. Could this be another predictor?
Do you have a microphone? Oh. No. You have a computer?
Yeah. So wonderful questions, wonderful comments, Ruben. Thank you so much. I think a lot of it is very implementable, and particularly at this stage of the paper. So I guess going in reverse order in which I received the questions, it's certainly no picnic to be in a coal mine, but in some ways, coal miners are some of the workers you would expect the least to want to not show up for work, because if there's no one in the mine keeping it operational, the mine goes out of commission potentially for several months, potentially forever. And essentially, the mining sector is one area where essentially people have to be working there constantly in order for the mine to be exploitable in the future. That said, I mean, the quality of working conditions certainly vary across these industries, but where we began to see miners starting to man checkpoints on a more regular basis, and I guess this also goes slightly to Scott's question about workplace mobilization, there are kind of two phases for this. One was a similar mechanism was at play here to the one that had occurred during the miner strikes throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. I guess to a more limited extent, the one that was here last week, but it's essentially a boss's strike type of situation in which the boss says, "I don't have the money to pay you. It's the state's fault. Go out to the square and protest." And in that case, certainly you're not going to be the one guy who shows up for work that day. There'll probably be someone left behind to keep the mine working. But either way, the root causes of this mobilization are the same. Wages go down, or they're not being paid. Opportunity costs go down. Now, in terms of workplace mobilization, so this is a key question, not just for this paper, but for the entire political economy literature on opportunity costs and these kinds of mechanisms, in that even with data as granular as mine, what I cannot say with a great deal of precision is whether this is a story about machinists joining the rebellion or machinists offering latent support for the rebels, or to what extent the people in these factories are actually being mobilized, or whether they're just not resisting Russian special forces or whoever it is might be taking over the town. That we do not know. I think the root cause of whatever the precise story is very similar. It's vulnerability to these shocks and the opportunity costs that Ruben mentioned and that I discuss in the paper. And it also varies over time. So as some factories shut down due to being taken out of commission by artillery shelling, people from individual factors, from individual minds, actually form platoons and squads based on the workers from that individual enterprise. So in some ways, these industrial enterprises have a preset organizational structure that can be used for mobilization along these lines. The same mechanism that could be activated during these strikes that have occurred throughout the Donbass over the last several decades. As regards some of the other points, thank you so much on the suggestion about the use of counter-revolution. In terms of exposure to Russian media, that is going to be, I think, perfectly collinear with territorial control. One of the first things that the rebels do when they take over a town is they take over the television station and they switch the channels from Ukrainian to Russian. To the extent that there is variation in this, and to the extent that previous exposure to Russian media affects the likelihood that a rebel attack will occur, the likelihood that rebels will take over, I think that's an important question that I need to look into. And if the data are out there and are accessible, I should put it in there. But thank you.